Welcome back to the research stage, everyone. We're going to take a little detour away from a hardcore focus on tech to sustainability and tech during this session called Africa's Carbon Time Bomb. I'm pleased to introduce Greta Dargie, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Leeds, who made an important discovery during her fieldwork in Africa. She discovered one of the world's largest peatlands, a wetland ecosystem in the Congo Basin. Why is this big news? Because these wetlands partially control the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. If these wetlands dry out, we're looking at increased global warming and dangerous climate change. Greta has a great message to share, that we can get it right if we take important steps now. This session is curated with Springer Nature, one of this research stage's partners. Welcome, Greta. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Deborah, and thank you for inviting me to give this talk. Okay, so as Deborah said, my name is Greta Dargie, and I'm a researcher at the University of Leeds. Okay, and so I'm just going to jump straight in with my talk. So my talk is going to be on the future of the Cuvette Centrale peatlands in the Congo Basin, which are the world's largest tropical peatlands. But first of all, I'm going to start by explaining what is a peatland. So a peatland is a wetland which has accumulated a thick layer of organic matter, which we refer to as peat. Now, peatlands are found all around the globe, but they can be quite different ecosystems. So for example, on the left here in this picture, you have a tropical peatland, which is covered in rainforest vegetation. And on the right, you have an Arctic peatland, which is covered in herbaceous vegetation. So obviously, these two ecosystems are under very different climatic regimes, but what they have in common is that they have accumulated this layer of organic matter. Now, in a peatland, this organic matter accumulates because the production rate of this organic matter exceeds the decomposition rate. Now, this organic matter is basically derived from dead vegetation which hasn't fully decomposed. So why do peatlands matter? Well, they're important for biodiversity, and they're also important for water regulation, whether that's through storing water or help mitigate against flooding. But one of the main reasons why people are so interested in peatlands is because of their role in the global carbon cycle. Now, peatlands cover just 3% of Earth's land surface, but they account for around a third of the global soil carbon stock. So they're super carbon dense ecosystems. Now, if a peatland is healthy and it's accumulating organic matter, then it's going to be a net carbon sink. But if the peatland becomes degraded or disturbed and it starts losing its organic matter through decomposition faster than it's accumulating it, then it becomes a net carbon source. So now we're just going to jump to the Cuvette Centrale. So the Cuvette Centrale is the world's second largest tropical wetland, and it's situated right in the center of the Congo Basin, and it's shared between the Republic of Congo and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Now, as well as being an enormous wetland, we now know that these wetlands are the largest tropical peatland complex on Earth. Now, how do we know this? Well, about 10 years ago, I started my PhD, and one of the aims of this PhD was to establish whether or not these wetlands were also in fact peatlands. So I decided to focus on a region in the Republic of Congo known as the Likoala Department. Now, the Likoala Department is mainly big areas of swamp forest, and it has a really low population density and very few road networks. So the main way to travel around this region is via the river networks by boat. So over the course of 3 years, myself and my colleagues, we traveled around the region by boat, visiting different swamp forest sites. And once we got to these swamp forest sites, we'd set up camp for up to 3 weeks at a time. And during our time in the forest, we'd be collecting data on peat depth, and we'd be collecting peat samples, which we'd take back to the UK for analysis. And we'd also look at the overlying vegetation of these peatlands. And what we found was that the peat in this region was associated with two distinctive types of vegetation. The first being this hardwood-dominated swamp, so a peat swamp dominated by trees. And these trees have special adaptations to the wet conditions. So for example, on the left-hand photo, you have a tree with big stilt roots to help keep it upright in the soft peat. And on the right, you have these aerial roots, which help the trees breathe when the peatland is inundated. And then we also have this raffia-dominated swamp, so this palm-dominated swamp. So these swamps are dominated by a species called Raffia laurentii, which has a really small trunk, but has these huge fronds that grow up to 15 meters long. Now, the finding that these peatlands are associated with these two different vegetation types meant that we could map these peatlands. So this area of wetland, the Cuvette Centrale, is enormous. So there's no way that you're going to be able just to map it from the ground. You need the help of satellite data. But it's important to remember that unless you completely strip the peatland of its vegetation, you're not going to be able to directly detect peat from satellite imagery. So what we have to do is rely on the association between peat presence and environmental indicators. So with optical data, so essentially photographs taken from satellites, you can map the different vegetation communities and therefore map the peatlands. But we can also use radar data to help us in this mapping process. So radar data is particularly useful because the satellite sends out this radar signal and it has a very long wavelength, which means that the signal can go straight through the forest canopy and interact with the ground surface. Now, if you have a forested area which is flooded, then the water on the ground helps reflect more of that radar signal back up towards the satellite. And this essentially means that in radar imagery, swamp forests appear much brighter than dry forests. So that helps in the mapping process. And we can also throw in elevation data to the mix. So peatlands in this region tend to form in depressions where water can accumulate and therefore decomposition rates are slowed down. But if you also have a forested region, then the type of radar data used to measure elevation has a shorter wavelength, so it can't quite get through the forest canopy. And what instead you get is a measurement of, instead of the ground elevation, you also get a measurement of the forest canopy. But this is also very useful for mapping peatlands because in tropical peatlands, they tend to have shorter canopies than the drier forests, or more open canopies as well, which can all be detected in the elevation data. So using this satellite data and our ground data, we were able to map these peatlands, and we produced this peatlands probability map. And so in this map here, the pinky purple color represents the palm-dominated peat swamp, and the yellow colors represents the hardwoods dominated peat swamp. And what we found was that the peatlands in the Cuvette Centrale cover an area of 145,500 square kilometres. So that's an area which is larger than the size of England. So these peatlands are enormous. And when we combined our area estimate with our data on peat depth and carbon density, we found that the peatlands store an estimated 30.6 petagrams of carbon. So that's 30.6 billion tonnes of carbon. Now, just to put that into some kind of context, that's equivalent to around 20 years of US fossil fuel emissions. So it's a really big carbon stock. So what now that we know that these peatlands are here and they are a globally important carbon stock? Well, by looking towards Southeast Asia, we know what we do not want to happen. So Southeast Asia is another region of large tropical peatlands. But unfortunately, only around 30% of their peatlands remain forested, with the rest having been converted mainly to palm oil plantations or pulpwood plantations. Now, this has led to large losses of biodiversity, but also because you have to drain these peatlands to make them suitable for these crops, it means that this results in large carbon emissions, because as you drain the peatlands and oxygen can get in, the organic matter starts decomposing and all that carbon gets released into the atmosphere. But one of the major problems is that of fire, because actually when peat is dry, it becomes very combustible. So in dry years, the peatlands are very vulnerable to fires. And these fires can spread very quickly throughout these degraded peatlands. Now, this results in huge amounts of carbon being released to the atmosphere over a very short time period. So, for example, in 2015, Indonesia became the fourth largest emitter of greenhouse gases in the world because of these peatland fires. Now, the problem isn't just linked to carbon emissions, but also you can have issues with air pollution. So it's estimated that around 100,000 people died in this region linked to respiratory illnesses because of these peatland fires. And it cost the Indonesian economy around 16 billion US dollars because of the impact on transport and industry. But the good news in the Congo is that currently the peatlands are pretty much intact. And a happy coincidence is that a large proportion of the peatlands are already under some form of protected area status. So these two maps here, the map on the left shows the peatlands in dark grey, and the green shapes are national parks. And on the right-hand side, you've got what's known as Ramsar Wetlands of International Importance sites. So this is all good news. However, simultaneously, unfortunately, most of the peatlands are also under hydrocarbon concessions. So in this map here, again, you have the peatlands in dark grey, and the red outlines are hydrocarbon concessions. And in 2019, the Republic of Congo government announced that in one of these concessions, a large oil reserve had been found, allegedly up to 359 million barrels of oil. Now, there are some questions over the accuracy of this claim and also the feasibility of actually extracting oil in such a remote region with very little infrastructure. However, it's certain that it's not good news for the peatlands. Likewise, you also got logging concessions which overlie the peatlands. And a few years ago, the DRC government lifted a logging moratorium, which means that some of these concessions which overlie peatlands are now up for bidding. Now, even if these activities do not occur directly over the peatlands, even if they're occurring within the vicinity of the peatlands, this can still have a negative impact. So, for example, in the two photos on the right here, the top photo shows a road leading to a logging concession which traverses an area of swamp forest. Now, the swamp forest is the slightly paler green coloured forest there. And in the bottom image, it's the same location, but just a few years later. And you can see that this swamp forest has completely died back. Now, we haven't managed to get there on the ground, so we don't know for sure what's happened. But from satellite data, you can see that the forest dieback radiates out from this road. So what we think has happened is that by building this road right across this swamp, there's been an interference with the hydrology of this swamp forest, and this has led to wide-scale forest dieback. Now, in addition to all the threats from land use change, you've also got what is possibly more problematic, and that is the threat of climate change. Now, in the Congo Basin, there's a real lack of in situ meteorological data, and we have a really poor understanding of the macroclimates within the basin. So that means there's quite a lot of uncertainty about how climate change is going to play out across the region. However, there's a general consensus that things are going to get a lot warmer by the end of the century. But in terms of rainfall, people are very unsure about what's going to happen. However, if there is to be a net reduction in annual rainfall or an increase in dry season intensity, this could all have very negative consequences for these peatlands. Because if things get warmer and drier, you're going to result in increased decomposition rates of organic matter. So you're going to have increased carbon emissions. And also, as things get warmer and drier, you also increase the risk of fires occurring. And as we've seen in Southeast Asia, this can have very disastrous consequences. But one reason to be hopeful for the future of these peatlands has been the positive response from the two Congolese governments. So following the publication of our peatland map and our first estimate of their carbon stocks, the two Congolese governments came together with Indonesia to sign what became known as the Brazzaville Declaration in 2018. And this is basically a South-South collaboration between these three countries to work together to conserve and sustainably manage the Congo Basin peatlands. However, there are a few barriers that need to be overcome in order for the two Congos to meet their commitment to protecting these peatlands. The first one is that despite the fact that the majority of these peatlands are under some form of protected area status, there's a real lack of funding for these protected areas. And therefore, that means that whilst on paper these areas are protected, the reality is that on the ground, there's not a lot going on. There's not a lot happening to actually physically protect these peatlands. And this is also the case for any environmental legislation. Unless someone's actually going to enforce environmental laws and regulations on the ground, then the reality is that these ecosystems aren't actually protected. You also have issues with competing interests within governing bodies. So, for example, the Ministry for Hydrocarbons in the Congolese governments are going to have a very different vision for how they want the region to be developed compared to the Ministry for Environment. So the two Congolese governments have a job trying to balance the need to develop the region for the benefit of the local population with the need to preserve the ecosystems there. Now, one way in which the two Congos could receive funding to protect these peatlands is through carbon credit schemes. Now, by that, I mean the two Congos could receive money to protect ecosystems that store large amounts of carbon. However, there are a number of structural issues with these carbon credit schemes at present, which means that a lot of the focus is on projects which either are reforesting previously deforested areas or which aim to reduce deforestation. And there's not really a lot of focus currently on protecting intact forests, which are currently not very threatened from deforestation. And you also have an issue whereby you need to have quite certain estimates of how much carbon these ecosystems are storing. Now, whilst we have presented the first estimate of how much carbon these peatlands store, there's a lot of work to be done in refining those estimates. But one of the biggest problems is just the lack of data from this region. So it's very difficult to make informed policy decisions if you don't have a good understanding of how these peatland ecosystems function. Now, this last point is relevant to me as a scientist because my job is to try and address some of these knowledge gaps. So after we finished our work on publishing the first map and carbon stock estimates, we started a new project which is called CongoPeat. Now, CongoPeat is a 5-year project and we're about halfway through now. And in CongoPeat, we want to focus on the past, the present and the future of these peatlands and try and address some of these knowledge gaps and pass that information on to people responsible for implementing policies related to the peatlands. So in terms of the present, well, like I said, we came up with our first map and our first carbon stock estimate for these peatlands, but there's still a lot of work to be done. So whilst we're reasonably confident about where these peatlands are and how big they are, our carbon stock estimate, our best estimate of 30.6 billion tonnes of carbon, has a really large uncertainty around it. So our 95% confidence intervals range from 6.3 up to 46.8 billion tonnes of carbon. So we have a really large uncertainty around that. And why is this? Well, that's mainly because peat depth can be very variable, and peat depth isn't something that you can predict remotely or detect remotely. You have to go into the field and physically measure the peat depth. Now, in this map here on the left, the orange lines were all my sites that I did for my PhD, and the yellow lines are sites which we've either currently done under the CongoPeat project or are hoping to do. So on the right-hand side, the yellow sites, those are all sites in the DRC. And previously, we didn't have any ground data from the peatlands in the DRC. So over the last 2 years, we spent a lot of time in the field collecting more data especially on peat depth, really hoping to be able to refine those carbon stock estimates. And we're also really keen to understand how carbon is cycling through these ecosystems and how these peatlands function. So over the last 2 years, we've had a permanent plot in a hardwood peat swamp and a palm-dominated peat swamp. And every month over the last 2 years, our colleagues have been going into these plots and measuring different elements of the carbon cycle in the peatland. So for example, measuring carbon inputs, such as litter production, root production, stem growth of trees, and measuring carbon outputs, such as CO2 fluxes, methane fluxes, and decomposition rates. But we also want to have a really good understanding of the past history of these peatlands and how they've developed. So peatlands are really good archives. So because this organic matter is all preserved, pollen grains are also preserved throughout the peat profile. Now you can look at these pollen grains under a microscope, and from this you can get an idea of what vegetation communities have existed throughout the peatland's history and whether there's been any changes in the vegetation community. Likewise, you can also look at the tiny remains of charcoal, and you can use this to build up a picture of how fire frequency has varied throughout the peatland's history. And we're also using radiocarbon dates to work out how old these peatlands are. So we know they're at least 10,000 years old, but we are getting more dates from different sites. So we might find that actually, in fact, in some areas they're older. And we can use these radiocarbon dates to also look at how carbon accumulation and organic matter accumulation rates have varied through time. Now, with all of this, we can look and see whether changes in vegetation or carbon accumulation rate or fire frequency coincides with, for example, past climatic events, or perhaps there's been an anthropogenic influence. Now, this all helps us have an idea of how the peatlands might respond in the future to any disturbance events. So all the data that we're collecting from the present and all the paleoecological records that we're going to build up, we're going to use all this to feed into two different models. So the first model is a model called DigiBog, and it's a peatland development model, and it operates on a very localized scale. Now with DigiBog, you can use it to simulate what might happen if you were to dig a drainage canal, for example, or construct a road over these peatlands, or what might happen under different climate change scenarios. And you can use this model to see what the impacts will be on the peatland hydrology and carbon accumulation. And the second model is a model called Joules. Now, Joules is a land surface model, and it operates at a much larger scale, operates at a regional scale. Now, currently in Earth system models, peatlands aren't actually represented. So any future projections of what might happen under different climate change scenarios don't consider what the impacts will be on peatlands, and also any potential feedbacks from the peatlands to the climate, whether that's through helping to mitigate climate change or in fact contributing to climate change. So the people in our project who are working on Joules are going to work to find a way to incorporate and include the Cuvette Centrale peatlands in future climate change projections. Okay, and although this isn't the main focus of CongoPeat, we now have a PhD student who's also going to look at how local communities are using the peatlands. Now, this is a really important area of research which really needs a lot more work done on it, because if these peatlands are to be protected successfully, then local communities' voices really need to be heard, and their needs also need to be met, because any intervention to protect these peatlands which doesn't consider the local communities that rely on these ecosystems for their livelihoods isn't likely to be a great success. And finally, although my focus tends to be on the role of the peatlands and the value of the peatlands in terms of their carbon stock and the role in the global carbon cycle, the value of these peatlands goes far beyond just carbon. So we know that these peatlands are home to Central Africa's most iconic faunal populations, such as the Western lowland gorilla or the African forest elephant. But there are many things that we just don't know about the biodiversity of these peatlands, whether that's the vegetation, the insect populations, fish, reptiles. So I'm sure there's going to be many discoveries to be made about these peatlands. And I'm sure their value will go far beyond just that of being an enormous carbon stock. Okay, so that pretty much wraps up my presentation. And yes, I think we're going to have some questions now. So thank you for listening.
Great. Thank you so much, Gertie. This was really, Greta. This was really interesting. I'm going to kick off the question and answer session with something that I'm thinking about. And that's the whole thing of knowledge transfer. How are you ensuring that Africans develop the capabilities to capture the data and also to monitor the peatlands in terms of, just tracking this carbon dioxide?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So within our project, CongoPeat, it's not just a UK project. We're also working with Congolese universities, both in the DRC and in the Republic of Congo. So the project has PhD students and professors involved. So really the PhD students will hopefully be the people who take this forward in the future there. But also we work in close collaboration with the two Congolese governments. So for example, in the DRC, the government recently set up a peatland management unit within their Ministry for Environment. And we're going to help the peatland management unit in capacity building to make sure that they have the information they need and also help them with the training. However, it's a good point because there are some issues in terms of both countries really need financial support to help build capacity to ensure that they themselves can collect the data that's needed, and they themselves have the expertise within country to ensure that they can properly manage these peatland ecosystems rather than it being other countries coming in and doing it for them.
Awesome. Another question just to follow up is, you talked about satellite-based technology, sensors and stuff. Do the locals have a different system with different tools to actually measure some of the same things, but not in such fancy terms?
Yeah, well, so local communities, I guess, no, but in terms of local scientists and within our project, so on the ground, we are measuring gas fluxes in situ. However, you kind of need both systems really, because this is a huge area and collecting data from this region is logistically difficult and it's also very expensive. And so even if you're measuring gas fluxes, every month, you're just getting a little snapshot of that data and at a very localized scale. So you need to find a way of scaling up your localized snapshot in time measurements, both temporally and spatially. So for that, you can use remote sensing techniques as well, so satellite data. So the key is using both. You can't just have remote sensing data, which gives you large scale and more over longer periods, but you also need that localized data as well to really understand what's happening on the ground as well.
Okay, I'm going to keep asking you questions then. How has this project changed your perspectives as a geographer? Because I can imagine, you helped discover this peatland. You've been working with local communities. Who gets to do this kind of stuff?
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess, I think prior to working in the Congo, maybe I wasn't as aware of the importance of the involvement of, for example, local communities. Because really, you can do all your, fancy science remotely, or, not engage with local communities, but actually you're never going to have a real impact unless you involve the people who are actually living in this region. And there needs to be, I think I'm now more aware of the kind of inequalities in access to knowledge, and how scientists really need to better communicate their findings to those who, to kind of your average person. Because really, if scientists are just talking to scientists and not effectively communicating what they find you're never going to have your work's not going to have as big an impact or result in the changes that you want to see.
Do you see yourself as a scientist or a technologist or a bit of both?
I'd say scientist.
Okay, but you're working with the technologists.
Yes.
Okay, we have a question here from James Dixon. How do you talk with local communities about the balance between income generation potential of environment and importance of resource preservation for climate?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I guess as well, it depends on who you mean by local communities. So whether you're talking to someone who is very local, so these are really remote regions. So, some of these communities, they don't have access to even phone signal. So there's a real inequality in access to knowledge. So even some of these communities might not even really be aware of the issues around climate change. So therefore, you've got to really find a good way of explaining the issue really from scratch. But whereas, if you're talking to someone who is an academic in Congo, obviously they're very much aware about the issues around balancing income generation and preserving the environment. So yeah, it's a tough one, because I think really local communities, these people are some of the most marginalized people on the planet with very little financial resources. So for them, their priority is finding a way to improve their livelihoods. Their concern, like I said, they might not even be aware of the issue of climate change. So for them, it's a difficult one to explain. I think whatever we do, we need to find a way to preserve these ecosystems, but really improve the quality of life for the people living in this region.
I see before me someone who is so passionate about this. Briefly, tell us how you even got into this field, because it's something that I can imagine is very different. I mean, African peatlands has nothing to do with your existence in the UK.
Yeah, I think it's probably not the most noble of reasons why I got into this. Basically, as an undergrad, I was very keen to get to the tropics for a bit of an adventure, and I got quite into soil science, actually, and carbon and the role of soil in the global carbon cycle. So soil science sounds initially quite boring, but actually once you start looking into it, it's quite fascinating. And then this project came up, this PhD came up, which was about looking at, trying to find peatlands in Central Africa and the role of peatlands in carbon storage. And so for me, it was just like the perfect fit. It was just a perfect follow-on from everything I'd done in my undergrad and master's.
Great. One last question, and then we'll wrap up. On a scale of 1 to 10, how hopeful are you that the peatlands in the Congo Basin will be protected, that people will care enough about climate change and global warming that they will not abuse those peatlands?
Yeah, I am hopeful. I am quite, I guess I'm maybe in the middle, because I'm quite nervous and anxious about the future of these peatlands. The thing that gives me hope is the positive reaction of the Congolese governments to the discovery of these peatlands. They do seem very keen to ensure that they are protected. But the two Congolese governments really need the support of the international community, especially in terms of capacity building and funding. And so I feel now it's really about kind of mobilizing the international community to make sure that they support the two Congolese governments, because without that support, I am concerned.
Thank you so much. We're going to wrap up. Greta, this has been just absolutely amazing and so informative. Thank you so much. You know, I love this session because we've learned that Africa really plays a huge part in the quality of our lives, and we need to protect its resources. Everyone else, thanks for joining this session. Feel free to explore the virtual expo booths and networking area during the break. And don't forget to share your findings on social media using the hashtag CogX 2021. A quick reminder that the next session on the research stage will be about how research can be used to fight misinformation, and it'll start at 6 p.m. Thank you so much again, and everyone else, see you then. Bye-bye.